All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our March edition of Voices for the West. Voices for the West is a webinar series brought to you by Advocates for the West. My name is Will Shoemaker, and I am Communications and Engagement Director at Advocates for the West. The title of tonight's webinar is Mining in the Modern Era, Poised to Repeat the Mistakes of the Past, in which we'll be discussing the 1872 mining law, efforts to reform it, and emerging mining threats throughout the West, particularly in Idaho. We're honored to be joined tonight by Haley Sweetland Edwards, a contributing editor at the Washington Monthly, along with Josh Johnson, Central Idaho Director at the Idaho Conservation League, and Advocates for the West staff attorney, Bryan Hurlbutt. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat section. And as is typical for our Voices for the West webinars, I have a request of you, our attendees, so that we can better get to know one another. If you would, please take a moment and drop into the chat a special place or species that is important to you that has been threatened by mining. I am writing into the chat myself right now. The Red Lady near Crested Butte, Colorado, otherwise known as Mount Emmons. This is a peak just outside of town that has been threatened for quite a long time by a molybdenum mine. You will remain on mute throughout the course of tonight's talks. However, we do welcome your questions. If a question comes to mind at any point during the course of tonight's webinar, feel free to drop it in the Q&A section. That's also located at the bottom of your screen, but is different from the chat, I will point out. You don't have to wait until the end of the talks to do so, and we will get to as many of those questions as time allows toward the end of tonight's webinar. So let's see, we have lots of things that are important to people that are threatened by mining, from Chinook salmon to the Mogollon Rim, I assume that is, in New Mexico, Santa Rita Mountains south of Tucson. Thanks for taking a minute and dropping that into the chat. We are honored to be joined tonight by Haley Sweetland Edwards. Haley previously served as Deputy Bureau Chief at Time Magazine in Washington, D.C., and as a domestic correspondent at Time, as well as a foreign correspondent covering Middle East and Central Asia for various outlets. Haley is the author of an article titled Showdown at Railroad Valley. A link to that article was shared in promotions for tonight's webinar. And I also will include a link to the article in a follow-up email to attendees. Don't worry, attending tonight's webinar did not require first reading the article as homework, but we will spend the first portion of the talk tonight discussing aspects of the article. How are you tonight, Haley?
I'm really well. Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Thank you for being here. So I think first off, what is Railroad Valley and why did it make the headline of your article?
Well, Railroad Valley itself is just a piece of federal land, about a 4-hour drive north of Las Vegas. And it's one of these places that when you visit, it's just vast, lunar emptiness. And I'd been there before. I'd ridden my bike through there, so I was interested, and I came across my desk, and I heard a story about NASA has been using that area since 1993 to calibrate their satellites. They need a sort of a specific surface for that, and in about 2018, I think, a company came in and spread mining claims all over the valley, claimed it for mining, lithium mining. And I thought, well, what's the problem there? You know, I saw this kind of controversy online. Thought, surely if a mining company wants a piece of land that's already being used by another federal organization, there's some sort of process that goes on, you know, some sort of high level bureaucratic process that happens here, you know, what is going on. And then at that point, I learned about the 1872 mining law and how it's just completely topsy-turvy. And that's what captured my attention. And that's how I started the article.
And with the 1872 mining law, if we were to talk about kind of the basic tenets of this law, which I will point out, you know, you pretty pointedly called in the article, quote, a unique dumpster fire of a law. What are these basic tenets of the 1872 mining law?
I mean, it's just this incredible law that the more you find out about it, as a non-mining expert, I came in, I was just like, this can't possibly be true. That can't be right. You know, I kept learning more and being like, what the heck? So it is actually one of these laws that's just so bad, and it's sort of universally reviled by almost everyone, you know, across the political spectrum in different ways. And what it says in essence is, you know, it was passed in 1872, so a time when you know, land grants and Native American removal, like a very different time of our history, sort of manifest destiny aftermath. And it says that any company from any country in the world, so long as they incorporate here, can walk onto any piece of federal public land, stake a claim, and it's theirs. They can, if they find valuable minerals, discover valuable minerals that can be mined profitably, then they get a, you know, Fifth Amendment protected property right over those federal public lands. It's a preemptory sort of claim. It's self-initiated, so you can just march on there, plant your little flag, and American public lands is yours. And I mean, that's the first thing I heard, and I thought, you know, surely this is being spun in a different way. Like, that can't actually be the law of the land, but it is. And it has the effect of warping the way that we are able to regulate how our federal public lands are used.
So let's to kind of offer a, you know, a point of comparison. How does that compare if we're talking about, you know, hard rock mining under the 1872 mining law? How does that compare to the system that governs other industries on federal public lands?
Yeah, so the basic difference is that all other industries, oil, gas, coal, timber, recreation, you know, filming a car commercial, you have to ask permission first. So you have to go to the federal agency that controls or that, you know, oversees that parcel of land, BLM or Forest Service, and say, hey, we'd like to use this in this way. And then you know, federal bureaucrats can say, hey, you know, I don't think that's a good idea. The watershed in this area is really important to this drinking water, or that is a good idea, and you can lease it under this fee structure for this period of time. And it's a permission system where a private organization or, you know, for-profit, nonprofit, whatever, you go to the federal government and ask permission to use federal lands. And then that permission is granted or not. And that is pointedly not how it works for mining. It is the only industry in the world that can actually has this self-initiated preemptory right to walk onto federal public lands and stake a claim.
So I want to cite a passage from your article. You write, the 1872 General Mining Act, passed in the wake of the Civil War in an era of Native American displacement, homesteading acts, railroad land grants, and a push to settle the Western frontier at all costs. But even in that context, the statute was almost immediately unpopular, decried as backward-looking, poorly written, and vulnerable to fraud. How is it this law could still stand for 151 years?
It's kind of incredible, actually. It's like, you know, even very early on, because it was passed in 1872, but it was actually based on these individual miners who were coming up with rules over campfires in, you know, the 1840s and 50s. So right off the bat, I mean, it was written also just sort of confusingly, and it allowed for all kinds of loopholes. And in 1880, so 8 years after it passes, there was a land commission that came out and just like had this list of ways that the law was being used fraudulently. Pretty immediately too, you had the conservation movement coming up and saying, hey, this is probably a bad idea. And in addition, you had this pushback from industry itself. By the early 20th century, when you had these larger mining corporations who were no longer Earl and his mule, they needed more than 20 acres, which the law is sort of based around these very small plots of these very small claims. So you kind of had pushback from all over the place, and there was it was rolled back in for a lot of different minerals, oil, gas, coal, sort of common building materials like sand and gravel. In the early 20th century were taken out from underneath the auspices of this law, but hard rock mining remained, and that's for a handful of reasons. There was political fatigue at that point. It was sort of the decline of the populist movement at the turn of the century. And at the time, there really were just a handful of sort of localized mines in Utah and Montana, I believe. So in DC, it wasn't so obvious that there was this massive giveaway of public resources for these materials. And the last thing that John Leshy mentions in his book, which is invaluable, our common ground, is there was this romantic public image of the solitary miner, Earl and his mule, kind of venturing out there and making their fortune on, with a pickaxe and in the Sierra Nevadas. So there was that too. So there was sort of like a pushback in DC of not wanting to repeal this disliked law completely.
So this utter lack of environmental protection around hard rock mining existed through the first part of the 20th century, but it began to change in the 1970s. How so?
Yeah, so the first part of the 20th century, the first 100 years that this law was around, was a complete free-for-all. You can't like overstate that. You would basically walk onto this land and people were claiming lands, building mines. There was no need for any environmental preview, no need for cleanup. I mean, there's so many rivers that have just been destroyed from those first 100 years that it was around. It's just absolute devastation. Plus the fraud, people would just claim these lands as it became your private property until the mid 1990s. So 1990s, this is the Clinton era. So this was a very bad law for a very long time. And in the 70s, you sort of got the initial guardrails that everyone on this call is probably familiar with, NEPA and Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act and FLPMA, and all of those came in the 1970s, and basically put on requirements for mining companies to pass these initial hurdles, but it didn't fundamentally change the system under which they were working.
So tell us a little bit more about the impact of these laws, because when you hear things like the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, having passed, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, this kind of suite of environmental protection, you would think that would address much of the degradation, especially to our federal public lands, that had occurred previously, and in fact prevent it. But that didn't happen. Why not?
Right. I mean, all of these powerful environmental laws, and they are important and powerful, but they operate within the architecture of this 1872 law, and it's this warped architecture. So thanks to the law, these mining companies already have property rights over the land in question. And that that warps the regulatory process. It means that BLM can't simply just say no in the way that they might to a wildly destructive oil or gas operation. They could just say, no, I won't lease this land to you. But when it comes to hard rock mining and other rare minerals, they can't say no, because these companies already have property rights to federal public lands, and so they don't say no. In 2016, there was this Government Accountability Office report saying that BLM and Forest Service were unaware of any instance where an agency had disapproved of a mine plan based on the results of any environmental analysis. It doesn't happen because of the 1872 law. This has the effect of shifting the regulatory burden. The answer is basically yes, you can mine this land that you already have property rights over, and then it shifts the regulatory burden to the courts. Suddenly you need advocates to sue to get the agencies to have more stringent reviews and things like that. And then in that case, you have judges who are deciding on the narrowest possible grounds. It's whether a NEPA review met some benchmark rather than the more fulsome question of, hey, should we even have a mine on this land in the first place? Does it make sense to have a gold mine next to a river that will pollute a capital city? Does that make sense at all? What is the public benefit of this and what is not? And when it comes to, and so the point of the article, I think, generally is that this discussion needs to happen. Like mining, the answer shouldn't always be no. There needs to be mining, but there needs to be a fulsome federal discussion or, around how federal lands are used. And the 1872 law precludes that, makes it impossible.
So where do efforts stand to reform the 1872 mining law? It seems like every few years we hear an update about a new effort that is underway. At this point in time, where do things stand, and do they stand a chance of passing given our current political climate?
Yeah, well, you're never going to lose money by betting that Congress does nothing. So putting that out there, but it is a really interesting moment for mining in Washington. For one, there's this push, by the Trump administration, by the Biden administration for domestic mining of critical minerals. And there's a national security issue there. There's a environmental issue there as we transition to electrical vehicles. That we're going to need lithium, we're going to need cobalt, we need these materials, or these minerals. So there's a push to get them, and that's coming from both the Democrats and the Republicans. And the 1872 mining law is kind of the elephant in the room. It's like, this antiquated kind of very broken law. It's been a golden goose for the industry for so long. But it also is deeply problematic for them. It was designed for, as I said, it was designed for the single miner out there with his pickaxe. So it presents very significant challenges to the industry as well. So you do see bipartisan push for reform. But I would say, that it's a herky-jerky situation right now. You have Republicans who are really pushing for a Reform Act that would remove all guardrails for the mining industry. And then you have, a Democratic proposal that has been proposed almost every year for the last decade and hasn't really gone anywhere. So yeah, if I were going to bet on it, I would say we're not going to see movement in the next couple of years, but we'll see. It's a presidential election year, so everything could change.
Well, thank you, Haley, for sharing your expertise, which I think sets us up nicely for our next panelist. Josh Johnson is based out of the Idaho Conservation League's field office in Ketchum. His work at ICL includes public lands, mining, air, and water quality, and efforts to clean up the Snake River in southern Idaho. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, Will, and hello, everyone. Thanks for spending some time with us this evening. Really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm here to talk about basic examples of mining in the modern era, and specifically, I'll be using all Idaho examples because that is where I do my work, and we work very closely with Advocates for the West and have for quite some time now to stop bad mine proposals through litigation, but then we also engage in some other ways as well. And this is Thompson Creek Mine near Chalice, Idaho, which we'll come back to a little bit later. So I start every presentation I do on mining, a little bit paradoxically, I think, for what people might expect from an environmental group. I'll start by saying that we need mining. It's just kind of a fact of our modern society, whether it's smartphones or computers or cars, we need mining. But we also value our environment. So it's really, what is that balance? Like, we're not going to get rid of mining. We're not going to say no to every mining project, but it's about finding out which ones are appropriate and get things that we actually need, and what is not advisable given the environmental impacts. Because mining is the #1 toxic polluter in the United States, and we could have a whole hour-long presentation just showing nasty orange water from mine sites across the country and across Idaho. So that is well established. I do want to spend a little time up front, though, talking about ICL's approach to mining, because I think we tackle it a little differently than other environmental groups, and kind of everyone has their own niche and their own reasons for dealing with mining and how they do. Certainly we have not been shy of going the litigation route when we need to. So we've done plenty of cases with Advocates for the West against exploration projects, all the way through full-blown mine proposals to polluting active mines or closed mines. And sometimes that is really necessary to stop bad projects. We're firm believers in the fact that some places are too special to mine, regardless of how amazing the mining company says a project will be in a certain area. Some places are just too special to mine. However, in other places, we have found value in directly engaging with the mining companies and the land managers to have an open dialogue about how to make their projects better. So we've gone out on site for almost every mining project out here in Idaho. We've had discussions with the company, like all the way up from the staff level to the CEO level, and are trying to raise the bar on some of these projects that could be improved. And then we've also gone even a further step in some cases to partner up with mining companies in a very specific fashion, not full partnering, but specifically to create voluntary conservation programs where mining companies put in money into a pot that the mining companies and ICL and sometimes other NGOs like Trout Unlimited help disperse to fund good projects, usually fish restoration projects in the watersheds that these companies are working at. But this is always additional to the mitigation they're required to do at their mine site. So we take a pretty varied approach depending on what the project is. And that's important because we have a lot of mining in Idaho and we have a lot of different projects. So this is a map just showing a lot of the big ones. This is from a slide from a Stibnite Gold presentation. So that is why that one is highlighted, but we will talk about that one a bunch here to come. But when we look at mining projects, we are evaluating them on a case-by-case basis. And we are looking at a few different things. The first is location, location, location. Like, that's the one thing that the mining companies cannot change, right? Like, the ore is where it is, and sometimes it's in a really challenging spot. For example, there's this proposed mine back in the late 60s at the base of Castle Peak in what is now the Boulder White Clods Wilderness. That's a prime example of a place that would be too special to mine. And so regardless of what a company would propose to do there, we wouldn't be okay with a mine in that location. The second piece of it is what is being mined. And this is where it has gotten a little more interesting in recent years, because instead of just having classic like gold, silver, copper projects, we're getting some interesting ones like cobalt. And, there is a pretty strong argument to be made of why cobalt can and should be mined in the US with US standards for both kind of working standards and environmental standards, because it's used in electric vehicle batteries. And so we start to weigh those things. But again, a cobalt project isn't going to get a free pass if it's a bad project. It still needs to be, have the right environmental safeguards in place. And then how it's being mined also matters, which is somewhat correlated to what is being mined. But, an open pit cyanide heap leach gold mine, is always going to be, kind of the worst outcome, as opposed to like a smaller targeted underground mine with less disturbance, which can still have its own issues, but it's just different. Like the amount of disturbance with the open pit mine is significant. So we evaluate all those things as we go through these projects. And now I'm just going to give you kind of a bit of a flavor for the kinds of projects we deal with in Idaho, and just spend just a little time on each one. I don't have too much to go into, too much time to go into for each one, but I'll start at kind of the exploration level. So this is a project called Kilgore. It is in the Centennial Mountains, which are somewhat near Island Park and about 50 miles west of Yellowstone. This is an area where we think it's inappropriate to mine there because of the importance of the area for wildlife migration, Yellowstone cutthroat trout, and basically headwaters of the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer to some degree. And so we have successfully litigated this project once before with Advocates for the West, and continue to keep an eye on it to make sure it doesn't turn into a full-blown open pit cyanide heap leach gold mine, which is of what the company has stated, could happen if they find the gold that they would like to find there. Kumo is one that many of you have probably heard of before as well. We've been in lots of litigation with the help of Advocates for the West over the years to stop earlier versions of this project, which is a proposed open pit copper and molybdenum mine in the headwaters of the Poised River. Again, not a great spot to mine. Regardless of what's being mined there, it's really down to the location. So this one is a bit of a zombie project that we keep fighting it back, and it keeps coming back. So we're awaiting another proposal going through NEPA with the Forest Service here soon. So keeping a close eye on that. And then as you start ramping up, you get to bigger and bigger projects. So Stibnite, I'll just touch on here, and then I know Bryan will go into a little bit more Stibnite because this is a very active one at the moment. So this was an area that was heavily mined in the past. You can see from this photo some remnants of old open pits, and the company Perpetua Resources has been trying for quite some time now to redevelop that into basically 3 open pits of a large gold mine. With the wrinkle recently being they are pitching it as an antimony mine as well. There is antimony there. It was mined in World War II and was important in World War II for its antimony source, and has some claims of being used for clean energy, like different battery technologies that haven't been fully proven yet, and for national defense. But at the end of the day, it is a big gold mine in the headwaters of the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River. And even though it has been historically mined, having 3 more open pits would not exactly rectify the situation. So Bryan will talk more about Stibnite, but that's kind of a big one at the moment that's going through permitting. And then I mentioned cobalt before. So Idaho is quite interesting in that it has the largest deposit of cobalt anywhere in the lower 48. It's basically our one viable domestic source of cobalt. And it is a proposed, well, it's actually almost operating mine. There's been hundreds of millions of dollars put into it. It is almost fully ready to go, but it closed before it could fully open last March due to low cobalt prices. So at some point when those prices rebound, we will have the only operating cobalt mine in the US. And this is one we've spent quite some time with this company over the years, developed a voluntary conservation action program with them. And yeah, there's a lot of reasons why it would be good to have a cobalt mine here if it can be done right. And that is, of course, the key. Right next door is a Superfund site from the 60s called Blackbird Mine. That is an old cobalt mine, exactly the example of what you don't want to do. Southeast Idaho, we have what's called the phosphate patch, which is a bunch of these kind of almost mountaintop removal, ridgetop removal, phosphate mines, which supply phosphate for fertilizer and phosphoric acid, which is eventually turned into Roundup, the favorite chemical that is getting litigated a lot right now. And this is an area where we have had an active dialogue with these companies for quite some time to improve their projects, deal with the selenium pollution that's going on from some of the rock layers getting into the streams. Yeah, I mean, the phosphate's a little bit different. There's a leasable mineral, so they have long-term leases on these properties, a bit different than some of the hard rock metals we talked about before. And those companies are definitely here to stay. And so our approach is to work, kind of put pressure on those companies, but work with them to improve their practices and their projects while being a watchdog role. And then Thompson Creek Mine, which was kind of my title slide there. This is a different part. That was the open pit. This is the 400-foot tall sand tailings dam, which is pretty scary. It's perched above a tributary of the Salmon River. And this mine has been in care and maintenance mode for about 10 years, but they are about to start mining one more phase. So like stripping off the last bit of overburden and mining a bit more of molybdenum primarily. And it's just one of those where it's just like, you know, the scale of these projects is huge. You've been on tours before, and it is impressive, but also scary. So, you know, good ones to keep an eye on. And then last but not least, we have our favorite abandoned mine sites. So these are ones that have, you know, were mined in the 1800s and the 1900s. And then the companies went bankrupt or are about to go bankrupt. And we've had many pollution issues and had successful litigation with Advocates for the West on a couple of these. The one on the left is Triumph, that is near where I live in the Wood River Valley in central Idaho. That, you know, we see that kind of water almost every year from that tailings pile. And because of a settlement agreement that ICL and Advocates for the West brokered several years ago, the state is responsible for cleaning up that site after a mining company left it behind and went bankrupt long ago. And Atlanta Gold, that's also in the Boise River watershed. That's Public Lands Director John Robinson, showing how nasty it is. And that was photos like from 15 years ago. He also went up there recently and recreated the photo. It's very similar, unfortunately. And so there's been arsenic, high arsenic levels there. And so we've also had successful litigation there. But again, at some point, if there's no liable party, that's a problem, right? Like who's going to pay for that? And that comes down to the taxpayers, unfortunately. So definitely cautionary tales as to, you know, what can happen when mining goes awry. And then I'll finish up here, just kind of highlighting the interesting nexus, I think, between mining and clean energy. This is, you know, made it a little more nuanced of how we approach these mining projects. I think back in, you know, the 70s and 80s and 90s, not even that long ago, you know, it was easy for environmental groups to just oppose all mines, right? It's like, why do we need this big gold mine? Why do we need this silver mine? What are we using that for, really? Now the conversation has changed a bit, but we don't want the pendulum to swing too far. And so, you know, a lot of these headlines are talking about the challenges of how do you balance the need for cobalt and lithium and other things for our clean energy needs with the environmental impacts that those mines can have, and trying to sort through what is kind of a legitimate, you know, mining operation that would actually help this transition along, or what is kind of masquerading as one. And that is part of the challenge. And, you know, I'll put critical minerals, like critical, in quotes, because, you know, that's a term that gets used a lot, you know, in the media, by mining companies, even by environmental groups. But it really is kind of playing into the industry frame of this issue. And so the industry narrative is something like this, like humanity is facing a climate crisis, and, you know, America needs to be a global leader, and we need to mine our way into solving these problems. And, you know, we should speed up permitting and remove some of the environmental regulations, get funding from the government, and kind of make this happen. Like mining can be the savior. And so, of course, our narrative is going to be a bit different than that, right? Like we are saying, okay, we're facing a climate crisis. That much we agree on. And what do you need in a climate crisis? You need clean water. You need, extra protection for wildlife who are suffering from the climate, extra protection for humans who are going to be suffering and adapting to climate change. And so as the demand for those minerals goes up, like we need stronger, not weaker protections. And I always, like to throw in the reminder that like mining companies are not altruistically trying to solve the climate crisis. Like they see this critical minerals narrative as something that is very strategic, and like objectively it's a strong play by them. It's like this is how we get the Biden administration like pumping up critical minerals and funding some of these projects is trying to do something in the clean energy transition, which is great, but we just need to be really thoughtful of how we do that. I mean, you think about all these transitions in the past, and they just haven't been done justly. Like often we see Native American tribes bearing the brunt of those issues and those mines, and that is looking like it's starting to play out already with these kinds of mining projects, lithium projects and things like that. So as we go forward into the new era of mining and the critical minerals era, like we need to think very carefully about still what mines do we need, what materials do we need, can we get them in less sensitive places, can we get them via recycling, which should be a bigger and bigger thing as we produce more batteries. So a lot to think about there. And yeah, I'll end there and pass it over to Bryan.
All right. Thank you, Josh. I'll offer a quick reminder if a question comes to mind at any point during the course of the talks, feel free to drop it in the Q&A section. It looks like we already have one question. Our next presenter is Bryan Hurlbutt, staff attorney at Advocates for the West. Bryan has successfully litigated and settled numerous cases to protect Idaho's wildlands, rivers, fish, and wildlife, and works closely with the Idaho Conservation League. Bryan.
Thanks, Will, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. Appreciate it. For anyone not familiar with Advocates for the West, we're a public interest environmental law firm based here in Boise, where I am. We also have an office in Portland, Oregon. And we represent conservation groups, tribes, and activists free of charge. And a big part of my work at Advocates for the West over the last 12 years now has been helping our partners push back against the constant pressure of mining, more and more mining on public lands in Idaho. As Haley and Josh explained, the mining law of 1872 allows and even encourages mining on our public lands. And until the mining laws reform, mining companies will have the upper hand. Forest Service, BLM, and other land managers will continue to allow mining companies to explore for minerals and to construct and operate mines. However, as Haley mentioned, mining operations must comply with environmental laws, which is what I'm going to talk about. These include laws designed to require public involvement and environmental review, laws to protect water and air quality, laws to protect fish and wildlife, and laws to protect public lands and our communities. And at Advocates for the West, we have a successful track record using these environmental laws to stop new mining projects from moving forward in sensitive locations. But the main thing I want to get people to take away from this is that these are long and hard fights, and none of them are over, especially with the 1872 mining law in place, as I'll show you through these 5 case studies, some of which overlap with things Josh talked about, but I'll be talking a little bit more about the cases and laws that we use in each of those instances. These are the 5 case studies that I'm going to quickly go over. And a few things about all of these. They're all located in Idaho. They're all on national forest lands. And at each of these sites, a mining company has acquired mineral rights under the 1872 mining law. And they've been seeking or had sought approvals from the Forest Service to do exploration work for valuable minerals. Typically, these mine explorations involve clearing forest land to construct roads and construct drill pads and to drill deep underground to gather samples so that the mining companies can map out the underground mineral resources there and potentially someday propose an actual mine. So for each of these, we filed litigation in federal court, not to challenge the underlying rights to explore for minerals, which the 1872 mining law sanctions, but instead to enforce overlapping environmental laws that apply. So Josh mentioned the Kilgore mine, and in 2018, the Forest Service approved the mining company Exelon's exploration plan for this mine. It's in the Camas Creek headwaters in the Centennial Mountains in eastern Idaho. The plan would involve 5 years of road building and drilling hundreds of exploration holes. And as Josh mentioned, the mining company touts this site as a potentially suitable place for an open pit cyanide heap leach gold mine. The Idaho Conservation League and Greater Yellowstone Coalition were very concerned about a large-scale mine in this unique east-west trending mountain range in the Greater Yellowstone region that is an important wildlife corridor. And so we filed suit and prevailed in our first round of litigation under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. For anyone not familiar with NEPA, it requires federal agencies to study and disclose the environmental impacts of the actions they're considering taking before they make a decision on whether and how to act. And here for the Kilgore project, the Forest Service acknowledged that drilling deep underground risked contaminating groundwater and surface water. And on half of the project site, the Forest Service gathered detailed information on stream and groundwater flows and water quality, which was used to evaluate the risk of contamination and protect against it. But on the other half of the project site, the Forest Service never gathered this important baseline information. And so based on that, the court found that the Forest Service had violated NEPA. It invalidated the Forest Service's approval of the project. But as often happens, the mining company and the Forest Service tried again, and the project was reapproved. And unfortunately, more recently, we lost in our second round case. But in the meantime, the mining company has been struggling, and it doesn't appear ready to pursue the exploration project anytime soon. But it's still out there, and it could still happen. Next, the Kuma mine. Again, Josh mentioned this one. It's in the headwaters at Grimes Creek, which is a tributary to the Boise River. Boise River is the lifeblood of the Treasure Valley and the largest communities in Idaho, including Boise and surrounding areas. And not a good place to build what the mining company Kumoko touts as a good place for the world's largest open pit molybdenum mine. Idaho Conservation League, Idaho Rivers United, and the Golden Eagle Audubon Society were concerned with this project, both with the exploration and the prospect of a large mine. And so we filed suit twice, and we've stopped the project twice so far. The first case we won on NEPA grounds, similar to the Kilgore one about water quality impacts from drilling. The second case, we prevailed under a different law, the National Forest Management Act, or NIFMA. NIFMA requires that every national forest has a land use plan governing the forest. And among other requirements, a forest plan has to include protections for sensitive species that are found there. And any project that's approved in that area has to comply with those forest plan requirements. The Kumo site's home to Sacagawea's bitterroot, which is a rare plant found only in the mountains of central Idaho. The Kumo site is home to the largest known populations of this species. But when it approved the exploration project, the Forest Service failed to protect Sacagawea's bitterroot from the roads and drill pads that the mining company was going to construct. And so the court invalidated the project that second time. And as Josh mentioned, this one also hasn't gone away, and we're currently anticipating it being potentially reapproved again sometime, maybe this year. Turning to Atlanta Gold, also in the headwaters of the Boise River, here near the town of Atlanta, closer to the Sawtooth Wilderness. I won't go into as much background here, but many sites for potential new mines have already had historical mining occur there and left behind old mine tunnels and old mine waste rock piles, which can cause contamination. At this Atlanta Gold site, an old tunnel had filled with water and was leaking out contaminations into Montezuma Creek. Mining company Atlanta Gold was up there laying out plans for a proposed open pit gold mine in the area, but wasn't doing anything to treat the already contaminated water coming off the site. And under the Clean Water Act, no one's allowed to discharge pollution to a water body unless they have a permit authorizing it and unless they comply with the terms of that permit. And so after an initial case against Atlanta Gold, the company did get a Clean Water Act permit, but they installed a very rudimentary pollution control. And for years, they were repeatedly violating the pollution limits in that Clean Water Act permit. So representing the Idaho Conservation League, we filed suit seeking compliance with the pollution limits that were in the permit. And in 2012, and then in some subsequent decisions, the court ruled in our favor and found that Atlanta Gold had committed thousands of Clean Water Act violations and ordered it to pay over $2 million in penalties to the US government, and also ordered it to take steps to come into compliance. Since then, the mining company has struggled, seems to be on the verge of bankruptcy, but they do continue to take some minimal efforts to keep treating the water at the site. But at the time, there's no plans for any mining there. This is the Golden Hand Mine. This is a site in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, the largest contiguous wilderness area in the lower 48 states. And that's right, even in wilderness areas, which are the highest level of public land protection, where not even riding a bike is allowed. Even in these wilderness areas, sometimes mining can still occur. They haven't escaped the mining law of 1872. We represented the Idaho Conservation League, the Wilderness Society, Wilderness Watch, and Friends of the Clearwater in a case that we won under the Wilderness Act to stop this mining project. In some instances, the Wilderness Act allows mining rights to survive, including in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, but only where the mining company can show that it already found a valuable mineral long ago. And in this case, the mining company, called AIMCO, sought the Forest Service's approval to build a road into the wilderness and conduct drilling, supposedly to confirm that they'd already found valuable minerals there decades earlier. But in 2016, the court agreed with us, and they found that AIMCO's plan really looked like new exploration, was not allowed under the Wilderness Act, and so the project was invalidated. But again, like with the others, the threat remains. It's not yet settled whether AIMCO does or does not have a right to mine there at some point. Turning to the Stibnite Gold Project. Here, the mining company Perpetua, formerly known as Midas Gold, has proposed building 3 open pit gold mines and a massive waste dump in this remote site, which is in the headwaters of the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River. We've had some successes in court with Perpetua on this project. In 2014, after we filed suit with Idaho Conservation League, together with the Nez Perce tribe, the Forest Service revoked Perpetua's exploration plan due to another law that we often use, the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act requires agencies to ensure that their actions, like approving a mine exploration, do not jeopardize threatened and endangered species, and the Endangered Species Act requires the agency to minimize the harm to the species and to its habitat. When the Forest Service approved Perpetua's exploration project, it had failed to protect against the threats to threatened and endangered salmon, steelhead, and bull trout from hauling fuel, transporting workers and equipment, and other activities along the miles and miles of narrow, windy dirt roads along the South Fork of the Salmon River and its tributaries that are on the way to the project site. More recently, in 2023, we favorably settled a Clean Water Act case against Perpetua, somewhat similar to the Atlanta Gold case. We represented the Nez Perce tribe there and secured a $5 million settlement due to the pollution from existing mine tunnels and waste at the mine site. But the fight continues. In 2016, Perpetua submitted its mine plan to the Forest Service. Perpetua could receive approval from the Forest Service as early as sometime this year, but in addition to the Forest Service approval, it needs many other approvals. The first and only notable approval for the mine so far is the Clean Air Act permit that the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality issued in 2022. We're currently representing the Nez Perce tribe and Idaho Conservation League in partnership with Save the South Fork Salmon and their attorney in challenging that air quality permit. We just had a hearing on March 14th before the Idaho Board of Environmental Quality, and we expect a decision from them on May 1st about whether that permit is valid. The air quality issues there mostly come from driving all the ore haul trucks along these dirt roads throughout the project site, which generates huge quantities of dust including arsenic-laden dust, which is both bad for people and for the environment. And when it approved the permit, the Department of Environmental Quality really kind of rushed through a lot of things and made a lot of oversights. We're hoping to gain some traction there. And we're gearing up to challenge other permits if and when they're issued for the Stibnite Gold project, and hopefully can have similar success as we have in a lot of these other battles. And that's all.
All right. Thank you, Bryan. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and boy, we've got lots of good questions. So I'm just going to dive into these. The first one, I think we hit on to some degree, but perhaps it would be worth addressing just so that we're super clear about this. Do mining companies provide any payment to the U.S. for their extractive activities? Who wants to field that one?
I can take that if others don't want to. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, they under the mining law, they don't have a set hard rock mining royalty. So unlike oil and gas, which can be like, I don't know, 8 to 10%. You know, if you're mining out there mining gold, like the U.S. government is not getting any royalties from that.
Let's see here. Why is the public unaware of the Mining Act and its consequences? There seems to be little to no sustained public education underway outside of the conservation community. Who wants to tackle that?
I mean, as a member of the media, I can sort of mea culpa that it's just not, it's a 150-year-old law, you know, it's written about extensively in the environmental community, as you noted. But it's just not, it's not making news. You know, there was a big hearing about this in DC in Congress last in December, and it got very little coverage also. So it's just fits and starts, and this isn't the most politically salient topic at a time when it's just, you know, it's a carnival out there in terms of getting people's attention. I'm sorry, that's a bit of an unsatisfying answer, but I think it's true.
So this one, perhaps, certainly anyone that wants to answer it, go for it. But Josh, I think you had touched on this. Cyanide heap leach gold mining, what is it? What are the threats that that type of mining poses? And isn't it illegal in some states?
Yeah, so cyanide is very toxic when it gets into the water, but it is very effective as a chemical for separating gold and sometimes other metals out from the ore that it's dug up in. So oftentimes the ore is dug up, crushed, put in a pile, cyanide is poured on it. Hopefully that cyanide is captured and then recycled and doesn't get into the waterways. But yeah, it's almost, I think every cyanide heap leach mine that has existed has had some leaks and issues, and it is banned in Montana and some other states. It was a citizen initiative in Montana, 1998, that banned it. So just next door, it is banned, but not banned in Idaho.
Let me ask a follow-up question to that. Is that an attractive element to, you know, a potential a mining company? Would they, you know, seek out, say, a gold mine in Idaho perhaps first because it is not banned versus, say, Montana or some of the other states that it is?
Well, I think it doesn't hurt, right? I mean, I think in this day and age, cyanide, the word cyanide is a bit toxic. So I think companies are trying to look for alternatives sometimes because it's super easy to attack a cyanide heap leach gold mine because it really, you know, that really resonates with the public more because most people know what cyanide is and how bad it is. But it is the cheapest and often most effective way for them to separate the gold from the rock. So it, you know, I think they would try to get away from it if they could sometimes, but it yeah, in a place like Idaho, those kind of projects become economical because they can use cyanide.
And if we're talking about open pits, what are the consequences to wildlife from open pits?
Well, once you create a massive open pit, it's not going back to what it was. Like, I think this is a key point of when you talk about like restoration and remediation of a mine project. Like, it is not returning the place to where it is, what it once was before mining. Maybe you get the pit filled back in sort of with the waste rock, but oftentimes even that doesn't happen. And so, it's just a lot of disturbance. Like, sometimes you need 100 tons of rock to get 1 ounce of gold, like depending on how low grade the ore body is. So that necessitates very big open pits, and that's obviously going to drive wildlife away, both for just the pit itself, but also like the blasting and the heavy equipment and everything that goes into actually mining that. Like, wildlife are going to stay well away from that. So problematic. And then there's famous examples of like the open pit in Butte that has contaminated water in it that birds go into and die because the water is so toxic. So that's part of it too.
And I'll just add that, the Thompson Creek pictures that Josh shared are pretty helpful for visualizing this, but there was the open pit itself, which is pretty shocking and massive. But also, most of what was removed from that pit has now gone into this tailings dam waste pile that was in another picture Josh showed, which is kind of equally disturbing. Both just massive impacts on the landscape, both sources of contamination, and leaving kind of a huge moonscape behind.
The 1872 mining law actually worked against a copper mining company in the Santa Rita Mountains in Arizona a few years ago when the Rosemont decision was halted. There is a provision that prevents dumping tailings on federal land, which was the key point that led to the Ninth Circuit Court in ruling against the mine. Here's the question. Given the political atmosphere today, do we trust that an updated mining law will work in the favor of conservation? Who wants to tackle that one?
I can take that. Yeah, the Rosemont decision was an interesting one and sort of showed how this antiquated law could be used against the industry as well. It was really like kind of a pain for them, and it was held up in appeals as the questioner mentioned. So that's very powerful, and it's actually changing the politics in DC in an important way. You do have industry groups who are saying, hey, this is not tenable to not be able to dump tailings on federal public lands because the law only allows you to claim to land that you have found valuable minerals that can be extracted profitably. So there is a push in Washington right now. There's a law that's that has bipartisan support and the support of the National Mining Association that would remove that requirement. That in order to get property rights over a piece of public land, you have to find valuable minerals that can be extracted profitably. This law would remove that provision. They're calling it the Mining Reform and Clarity Act, I think. Would be just catastrophic if it passed, and it has quite a bit of support. So yeah, I think I don't think that any reform of the 1872 mining law would necessarily benefit or be good for conservation efforts. That's a super good point. Another part of what I was just thinking about before is my mealy mouth answer about why this is not on front pages, why there's not a public education campaign, has to do with the complicated politics in DC. It's not as simple as saying, it's not on the Democratic platform, for example, to repeal the 1872 mining law. It's, because you have big representatives, Democratic representatives in Nevada, in Arizona, in big mining states, Democrats are supportive of mining industry um, um, legislation, you know, that would be make it easier to mine. So it's not very simple. The politics are complicated. The other part is that, you know, to nod to Josh and Bryan, it's just like there's a concentrated benefit to these companies, and the costs are borne much more diffusely. So it's difficult to say, you know, like, how does airborne arsenic, you know, how exactly does that affect? How do you measure that cost versus this company made $100 billion? You know, that's a measurable benefit to a very small group of people. And this notion of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, I think, explains a lot of how DC works. But specifically, like, why this law is not doesn't have the public spotlight.
Yeah, and I'll just add on the public spotlight, you know, every now and then there is some kind of mining disaster that happens and gets a lot of attention. The Mount Poly incident in Canada a few years back, and the Gold King mine disaster in Colorado a little bit more recently. And with those, you see kind of a surgence of awareness and interest in reforming the mining law and doing it for conservation purposes. But they just never quite get anywhere. Like, as Haley mentioned, there are a number of Democrats and others who are just, you know, unwilling to cut back on mining. So on the one hand, it's interesting that there's maybe some opportunity for mining reform now, but it is pretty scary in that it's being a bit industry driven and kind of in connection with this sense that we need to, you know, mine more critical minerals as quickly as possible. There's a lot of reason to be concerned about what could happen with potential mining reform right now.
All right, we have time for one more question, and I'm going to try and mash two of them together that are related to cover as much ground as possible in a short amount of time. How often do agencies such as IDEQ, IDFG, and IDHW monitor the pollution and toxicity that is produced from mines and ultimately consumed by wildlife? What is the track record of industry attempts to control runoff with containment ponds? So kind of from two different sides there. Who might want to tackle that one?
I can take a stab at it. Well, first of all, I'll say the track record is not good. That is why we have as many kind of mining issues, legacy mining issues we've had over the years. And you know, you'll hear the mining industry say, "Oh, well, we've got new technology, you know, new mines," and it's like, well, you know, you're still doing a massive you know, disturbance of the earth, and contaminating waterway, like potential to contaminate waterways, is high. As for the state, it's not as much the like monitoring piece. Like, one of the things we often try to secure in the permitting for these projects is to make sure that the Forest Service is requiring the companies to monitor and use a consultant and to monitor their the waterways around the site, and then have that data sent to the Forest Service and then to DEQ as well. The problem is enforcement. Like, if their things are too high, then what next? So, like, for example, we worked with Advocates for the West for a mine called US Silver, that, you know, the publicly available data was showing that they were, you know, polluting arsenic, and DEQ was not going out of their way to enforce those violations. They needed a push from ICL and from advocates to do that. And so that is often our role, is to make sure that the regulatory agencies are, you know, basically doing their job and enforcing these laws.
Yeah, and you have to remember that, you know, with these huge mine sites, even a company that's doing a pretty good job is probably still going to have problems. That's what the track record with mining shows so far. But then also, these things last for so long, and the need for water treatment and other things, that, you know, it spans hundreds to even more years. But these mining companies aren't going to be there. Perpetua, despite its name, Perpetua, they're not going to perpetually be up at the Stibnite site treating water and ensuring that their site rehab works for hundreds and hundreds of years from now.
Thank you, Haley, Josh, and Brian, for sharing this information on such an important topic. And thank you to our attendees for your thoughtful questions this evening. Important work that groups like Advocates for the West and the Idaho Conservation League are doing is only made possible thanks to folks like you who are with us tonight. If you feel inspired, we hope that you will give a gift to help us continue this important work. I will be sending out a follow-up email that includes links to ways that you can support us and to the recording of tonight's webinar. Please feel free to share it with anyone who you think might be interested in our work. We do hope that you will join us for our next Voices for the West webinar. It's going to be on April 24th. We're going to try something a little bit different with this next one. It's going to be an hour long, like most of ours. However, it's going to be in the lunch time frame. It's going to start at noon Mountain Time and last until about 1. And we will be discussing the intersection of environmental activism and the arts. And we'll be joined by artists and professionals working at that nexus. So stay tuned in the weeks ahead for more info on that webinar. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.